Now, as a request from one of my high-tier Patreons, they wanted me to make a tier list detailing the best pet types in pet battles. Little known fact, I actually have a side pet battle channel that I ran for a few years, and there isn't a single WoW YouTuber or streamer who knows more about pet battles than I do. So, let's get into ranking some pet battle types. Now, I know most of my audience knows almost nothing about pet battles, but the type system in pet battles is kind of like a game of rock, paper, scissors. Every single type is strong against one other type, and they're resistant against one other type, and they're also weak against one other type. And that's it. There are no double types or double weaknesses or double resistances. It's pretty simple, and the types are different in that each one gets their own little special ability, but some of them are much better special abilities than others. And that's where the ranking and tier list comes in. So, let's go to the tier list. First, we have the aquatic type. The special ability of the aquatic pets is that they simply take 50% less damage from dot abilities. Now, one of the best moves in PvP pet battles is a dot, so pretty useful. We can definitely rank the aquatic pet as B tier. It is useful for countering one specific type of damage, but that's about it. There is another really good benefit of aquatic type pets, in that their type is the one which takes less damage from undead type moves. And the best dot in the game happens to be an undead ability. So, aquatic type pets take almost no damage at all from one of the best moves in PvP pet battles, which kind of elevates them to top tier status for that alone. Although that particular dot has been nerfed 4 times, so it's not really as relevant as it used to be. So B tier is kind of where it stays, since the actual ability itself is kind of mediocre, but it is pretty decent against some meta teams. Now let's go over to one of the S tier types, since we'll be talking about it a lot, and that's the undead type. Undead is easily S tier. It's one of the few types to actually get a nerf because it was too strong. What the undead racial does is when the pet dies, it becomes immortal for 1 full turn. It also deals 25% less damage while it's immortal, but it used to deal full damage for that 1 turn of immunity. Now, pet battles is a turn-based system, so the undead racial allows every single unpet a guaranteed extra 2 turns of abilities before they finally go down. 1 extra turn to finish off the turn that they die, plus the turn afterwards. The amount of advantage you get from 2 full extra turns is insane, and it's easily the best type in the game. A pet will have an advantage for just being undead type, and other pet types will have an advantage if they're able to counter undeads. It's kind of the gold standard for pet battle types, since it's like 100 times better than almost all the other pet types, except for one other S tier which we'll talk about later on in the video. Now we have the beast type. This one could be considered B tier. The beast type simply allows beast pets to deal 25% more damage if it's below 50% health. This is actually very useful on pets like the vengeful porcupet, since it's able to stay below 50% health for a long time and deal out a lot of damage as a cleanup. Although it's very hard for a lot of other pets to take advantage of staying below 50% health for this little boost, since it is a permanent boost just as long as you stay at the health point value. And 25% extra damage is pretty good. If it wasn't so difficult to stay at that threshold, it might be pushed up to A tier pet, as beast types in general don't really have too many ways to stay alive that long. They generally revolve around hitting hard and fast and not staying alive for too long. Next up we have the critter type. This one would probably be around C tier, maybe low B tier. The critter type simply has a special ability where they're just straight up immune to most forms of CC. Not all of them, just all of the hard CCs that cause lost control of your character, like stuns, polymorphs, sleeps, and even roots. But it doesn't prevent them from being affected by accuracy reducing abilities, like blinding poison, which reduces their chance to hit by 100%. It's definitely a CC, but it doesn't count as a CC, so it's one of the things that critters are not immune to, which is why pets like the Death Adder hatchling are pretty strong in PvP. They're one of the few pets that can actually crowd control the critter, and outspeed them on the norm. Now, critters actually saw a lot of play in pet PvP because they're the type which deals extra damage to undead. The undead type is so strong that critters saw a lot of play because they're the undead counter, funny enough. And the little theme of critter pets is that most of them are very fast, so they're able to outspeed a lot of pets on average. Although, with a few outliers like the Death Adder hatchling being able to outspeed most critters, and could be considered the anti-critter pet. Next, we have the dragon type. This is another B tier ability. B tier bordering on C. It's kind of not as useful as the beast or aquatic racials. The Dragonkin ability is kind of like an execute, where if a Dragonkin is able to cause a pet to go below 50% health, it will then gain a buff on its next turn that increases the damage it deals by 50%. And a 50% damage boost for one turn is not half bad, especially if you're able to use it on a full team-wide AoE like the Twilight Clutch Sister, who is a top tier pet. The ability also procs if you're able to bring one of your opponent's backline pets below 50% health, so it doesn't need to just be on an active pet. So AoE abilities are pretty strong on Dragon-type pets, and one of the best AoE abilities in the game just happens to belong to Dragonkin pets. But even with this perfect synergy, it's still only a B tier type. It's only situationally useful outside of this one overpowered ability, and generally it's kind of wasted most of the time, as a lot of dragons have very high attack power values and don't have problems finishing off low health pets anyway. And it's also kind of useless on undeads since they get those 2 turns after they die to keep doing stuff anyway. And the next type is the Elemental, which is definitely a D tier. Or would be F tier if I added that to the tier list, although it does have its uses, so it's not completely useless. So I guess D tier is actually very appropriate. Now, what the Elemental type does is Elemental pets ignore negative weather effects. Weather effects are a thing that only exist in pet battles if a pet specifically uses an ability which has a weather attached to it. So if you or your opponent don't have any weather changing effects, then the effect is basically useless and does nothing. And also, of the types that do have negative effects attached to their weather, they're not really that big a deal. So it has the potential to just not do anything at all, kind of like the critter racial or the aquatic racial, but there is at least more dots and crowd control effects than there are bad weather effects. One of the worst weather effects is just Call Darkness, which lowers all healing you take by 50%. You can completely ignore the negative side effects of this, but it doesn't really help you win pet battles. Funny enough, it does actually help you win against Darkness teams, even though I just use that as an example of something that's not super good, because Darkness teams will set up the weather effect Darkness so they can use the ability called Nocturnal Strike, which hits incredibly hard but has the downside where it only has a 50% chance to hit. So it will have a 100% chance to hit if the target is counted as blinded, which the Darkness weather effect sets a pet as. But Elemental pets ignore this condition, so if it tries to use Nocturnal Strike against them, it actually only has a 40% chance to hit. And Elemental pets are pretty decent at countering Darkness teams. And Darkness teams are pretty good in PvP. Although, Undead pets also counter Darkness teams, so they don't even really catch a break there. Next up we have the Flying type. This is definitely A tier, bordering on S tier. The Flying racial is pretty simple. If a flying pet is above 50% health, then they have 50% more speed. And speed is the stat that determines who goes first in the turn-based combat system. And generally, going first is preferred, because if you're able to kill your opponent's pet, then they can't attack you during that round. And also, there's a couple of abilities that deal extra damage if you go first, and it allows you to set up a CC or dodge to get an extra turn out of those abilities. So because there's so much advantage to going first, flying type pets basically always go first unless there's another flying type pet out on the field. And the only way to counter this is to just take them below 50% health. And there was a pet in the past who was very good at getting itself back above 50% health and taking advantage of its high speed in another way, and was one of the strongest pets in the game's history. That was the Terrorclaw hatchling. Although they nerfed that pet after Legion, so there isn't really a super S tier flying type pet anymore. But it was definitely the flying racial that allowed the Terrorclaw hatchling to be so powerful. And it's just a great benefit to Darkness teams as well, as part of the reason Darkness teams do so well is because it's mainly birds who do the Call Darkness Nocturnal Strike combo, and since they're always going first, are generally two-shotting pets before they get a chance to hit them back 2 times, unless you run into an Undead who has a guaranteed 2 extra turns to hit you anyway. The next racial we have is the Humanoid racial, which is another A tier ability. The Humanoid racial is just a passive heal, where if they've dealt damage during the round, then they heal for 4% of their maximum health at the end of the turn. And the way to take advantage of this is through dots and other long-lasting abilities like Immolation. Currently, there is a pet called the Fiendish Imp who has an ability called Immolation, which deals a tiny bit of damage to the frontline pet, stays up for 9 rounds, and works even if the pet is on the backline. So the Fiendish Imp can heal up for about half of its health in the backline while dealing damage, which is pretty good. But a lot of humanoid pets don't have dots or constant damage, So it's kind of wasted on a majority of them who can only heal while they're out in the front line actually doing damage. The way to really gain advantage from the humanoid racial is through multi-turn abilities. Outside of that, it's kind of mediocre, as it's a really small heal. Although some of the best pets in the game are top tier specifically because of the racial. One of the bad things about the humanoid racial though, is that humanoids are weak to undead, and undeads are kind of the kings of PvP pet battles. So even with their amazing healing, they can kind of be beaten pretty quickly by most undeads in the game. And a very effective team in PvP pet battles is just to run any 3 undead pets, and you'll have a very good chance of winning a lot. So humanoids need to be kind of overpowered to be considered top tier because of how good undeads are, and there are a few that definitely meet those criteria. Next up, we have the magic racial, which is definitely another D tier ability. The magic racial is almost useless, just like the elemental one, where if the magic pet would take more than 35% of its health as damage in one ability, then it instead only takes 35% of its health as damage with that ability. So a magic type pet cannot be one-shot, which makes it a good counter for teams that are just trying to one-shot pets, which isn't really a thing in PvP pet battles. That's kind of a gimmick, which is not very good. But in PvE pet battles, this is actually useful against some fights, kind of. Undead pets kind of also counter this as well, as do mechanical pets. So it's just kind of an option if you need magic damage for whatever PvE fight you're doing, as it's not very useful in PvP. Funny thing is though, the magic type racial used to be even worse. In its original form, it only prevented one-shots from 50% of your health. But at the very least, you have to hit a magic type pet 3 times before it goes down. And most of the time its racial will never activate because there aren't really a lot of pets that hit very hard outside of darkness teams, which magic type pets do actually do kind of a good job at countering as well. But again, undead pets also do that, and so do mechanicals, so it doesn't even really have that niche in PvP pet battles. Now, there are a couple of pets who are purposefully given very low stats for their health so that the racial will activate more often, but are also given an incredibly high attack power value to make up for that low health. So pets like the Servant of Demidos and Anomalous are actually pretty good and are able to make use of their magic racial because they're the definition of glass cannons, with Anomalous currently being the best pet in the game for PvP pet battles even. Although they'd probably be better if they had an actual good pet type. So despite this pet type getting a D tier and being one of the worst ones, currently one of the best pets in the game does have this type. So it's a good indication that pet type doesn't necessarily mean the pet itself will be useless. And lastly, we have the mechanical racial, another S tier ability. The magical racial allows the pet to come back to life after it dies with 20% of its health. Unlike the undead pet though, it's not guaranteed to die after it comes back to life. So it is possible to heal mechanical pet up after it's activated its failsafe mechanic. And also you can just swap it to the back in order to save it for later, which is something that you can't do with undead pets. The thing that makes the undead racial a little bit better though, is that it's a guaranteed full round after it dies, whereas the mechanical pet can still be outsped on its new turn after it comes up. So for example, if an undead pet goes after a faster pet and then dies, it will come back up during that round and finish it off like normal, and then get the next round in order to attack as well, before dying at the end of the turn. Where if the mechanical pet dies to a pet that's faster than it, it will just get killed in the next round before it gets a chance to do anything because its health is so low when it comes back. But even then, coming back to life after a kill is still super good. Ridiculously good. And mechanical pets are super strong because of this racial. And the racial even got a nerf early, as it used to bring them back to 25% of their health, instead of the 20% it is today. Alright, and that's the tier list on pet racials. I mainly focused on PvP pet battles, because in PvE pet battles, it's all about just using whatever's the best possible counter to whatever specific pet you're going against, and it doesn't really take a lot of racial abilities into account at all. And in PvP, you can't really account for having the perfect counter to every situation, so you want your racials to be more versatile.